Hi, I'm Al from the Money Study, bringing you another episode of our Take 10 Challenge. Up to number 34. We're going to leave super for a while. We've been talking about super for the last week or so. Now we're just going to start looking at other alternatives and just this whole big question of should we jump into some shares perhaps, or should we get an investment property, or what are we going to do here? Let's have a look at a bit of the pros and cons. Before we do, there's the disclaimer. Facts and figures, information only. This is not advice. Now, of course, let's have a quick look at property first. And I will be doing lots on property later on, and I'll also be doing lots on shares later on. We're going to be talking about investing off and on over the next weeks, months, years, whatever, however long I keep on going with this thing. But investing in property, it's got to be a long-term investment. You know, the costs of getting into a property are quite substantial. With stamp duties and other taxes and so forth, and just expenses in setting up loans and goodness knows what else. So it's expensive to get in and pretty much expensive to get out. So generally speaking, you can't buy a property and sell it the following week unless you absolutely knew you could make a killing. There was some reason that you knew you could turn around and, it was an absolute, gift to buy this place almost, and you could indeed just do a few things to it and turn it around. But generally speaking, a property should be for the longer term, and when I talk longer term, 10 years plus is probably what you really should be looking at to hold a property to make all the numbers normally work for you. Requires a pretty large deposit normally, though most banks want at least say 20% deposit without the use of mortgage insurance, which we'll talk about later, or we are basically putting the equity of your home at risk because we're tying up the equity in your house as the security against the new investment property. But either way, it takes a substantial either cash injection there or a bit of a risk factor if we want to get into a property. It's illiquid in short terms and certainly can be more illiquid at times than others, meaning that you may not just be able to sell this thing on the day that you want to. Could take weeks, could take months, and in some cases if you're not prepared to drop your price, it may be years. In fact, I had a lovely gentleman who had a rental property in one of the mining towns. Got it for a reasonable price, but when he came to sell it, in the meantime, the mine had built a men's quarters. They didn't need the accommodation in town, and his house value had gone down by 90%. And he said he's just going to wait for the price to go back up again. Well, I'm not too sure he was ever going to get his money back. And of course, so that's sort of a very illiquid investment. He couldn't sell it when he wanted it to because it's right at the bottom of his market. The advantage of an investment property, generally speaking, is the fact that most people will actually borrow the money to do it. Now that sounds sort of counterintuitive that we're borrowing money and that's helping us. The reason being is that if you have indeed put down, say, $100,000 deposit, you borrow 400, and so you've got a $500,000 unit, and it goes up by 10%. You've just made $50,000, but you only really put it up 100,000, so you've really made 50,000 on your $100. Now, of course, there's a lot of costs and things involved in all of that, but you get the idea. By borrowing the money, the asset that we've got, if it goes up by even a small percentage, we're actually making quite a bit of money on our original investment. Where people are not quite so prepared to borrow money and buy a $500,000 share portfolio, that might be a little, they look at that and go, oh my gosh, and yet in theory the principle is exactly the same. Negative gearing. Now we're going to talk about negative gearing and its benefits and so forth in a later session, but negative gearing is effectively where you've bought a property, you're renting it out, but the rent does not cover all the expenses. It's going backwards, you're losing money. And people rave about negative gearing. Oh, look at all the tax deductions I'm getting. But if you're getting tax deductions because you're just losing money, at what point does it actually make you money? But I'll go through that a lot more later on. It does come down to what you're earning and your tax bracket and so forth. But of course, in retirement, a lot of people think, oh, I'll have an investment property in retirement. Do you have any tax to deduct in retirement? If your superannuation is 100% tax-free, does it make sense to tie up $1 million if all you're doing is collecting rent and have to pay all the expenses? We'll go through that as well. Of course, where are we in the property cycle? If someone can actually tell me, I'd love to know. Obviously, it depends on whether we're talking, sort of in Sydney, are we talking about somewhere in Broome, or Burnie and Tassie, or whatever it may be. There'd be quite a substantial difference in the property markets. There's no such thing as a property market. They can talk about Australian averages, but depending on where you're buying, that could be a totally different situation. As I say, mining towns can be totally different than buying in a city somewhere, in a big capital city. So where are we? Look, it's been bizarre that we had some of the biggest rises during the middle of COVID, which is obviously when money was sort of handed out and low interest rates, and that sort of stimulated. It went up. And then at the end of COVID, when interest rates started to go up, there was some property going down. But property's actually had a bit of a flurry of late, even though interest rates are going up, because they're expecting now that interest rates might go down. And so people are jumping in before they do because they think there's going to be too much competition. I'm not convinced, but anyway, I don't know where properties are going to go. I really don't. And I don't think anybody can really, well, no one knows the future, that's for sure. So it really is a case of doing your homework, finding out. It's really more a case of perhaps buying the cheapest house in the best suburb, in a good street, so that you've got potential to bring it up to the standard of that street and make more money from it. Whereas on the flip side of all of this, if we're looking at shares, shares have done very well over time. Their returns been better than bonds or gold or cash and so forth. Pretty similar to property, but say people perceive this risk factor of shares in the regard that they can see shares go up and down every day, but they don't see their house price go up every day. So that can certainly be an issue. But shares, there's certainly a place for them because they do have some advantages in regards to their structure and so forth compared to perhaps property. And you might have a leaning towards one or the other, and that's fine. You might do both, but you need to understand the benefits and pros and cons. See, shares also should be a long-term investment. However, a lot of people do sort of shorter term, what we'd call trading, because they believe if there's a company that's going to make an announcement, that if they get a certain pharmaceutical is going to be approved, that it could go up, or a mine might be getting some results of a mining exploration. These things, there might be a great potential for a quick surge as the news comes out. So people jump on board before, hoping or expecting that they've got the right answer. Probably the best advantage of shares is you can start at a low level. You don't need to have a thumping great big deposit. Generally speaking, in Australia, you can start off with as small as $500 as the minimum parcel of shares that you could buy. So, and you can scale in and scale out, meaning you could, put 500 in, then another 500 and so forth, and just build and build and build. And similarly, when you sell, you don't have to sell it all. You can't, with an investment property, you can't just sell it off in a bedroom. You've got to sell the whole lot. But with shares, you could just sort of, sell off a bit to lock in some of the profit and move it around to another different share that's got greater potential and so forth and so on. The liquidity, getting out, for the sort of things that you would normally buy, and being just a solo person, unlike, big corporations and super funds, you might own millions of dollars or something. If you're only going to own a few thousand or even $100,000 in a particular share, normally with a bigger share, not a problem. You could sell it, click the button, it's gone within 3 seconds, and have your money within a few days. You can still borrow money. That's what we call leverage. So it's like housing. We can leverage it up, get better advantages, and any borrowings are tax deductible, just like a house. So you can do all the things you can do with a property, you could do with shares, but you can set the level at whatever risk and what sort of debt you particularly want to take on there. Where are you in the share market? I think episode 20 or whatever it was, we sort of talked about the share market. It's got its problems, I believe, as well. Now, so what does that mean? We will talk about this whole problem, if investing when things aren't so good, and we'll go through that in another session. But just some thoughts there in a comparison. What sort of suits you? What are you trying to do? What's your time frame? How much money you've got? How much you're going to add to it? Are you going to do it regularly? All of these things come into play when we determine what type of investment we're going to go for. We'll talk about a little bit more of this in some of our future episodes. Look forward to you joining me.